Good evening, everyone, and happy Election Day Eve. I'm Mayor Pro Tem Tasha Harper-Madison, proud City Council representative of District 1 in East and Northeast Austin. Welcome to another edition of my bi-weekly talk stream, live stream, Talk with Tasha. We're coming at you every 2 weeks with critical conversations about the issues that matter most to you. Equity and mobility. It's a hard thing to achieve when all you prioritize is cars. And for the past 75 years, that's what we've done here in Austin. Relying on roads alone has made driving the best option for getting around for most people. And considering the crushing congestion we're most famous for, it's probably more accurate to call it the least worst option. For families living in the economic margins, car dependence comes with inequitable impacts. AAA estimates the average annual cost of a car ownership is around $10,000. According to one source, a low-income family spends nearly 1/3 of its household income on transportation costs alone. Compare that to 13% for middle-income families. Other residents who can't afford to drive or are unable to due to age or disability or any other reason are stuck with our second-class bus system. Trips by bus can take 4 or 5 times longer than by car, and transit-dependent riders are cut off from whole swaths of the city that don't have bus service. To top it all off, car crashes disproportionately injure and kill Black, brown, and lower-income people. Luckily, our voters decided it's well past time to fix this state of affairs. Last November, Austin overwhelmingly approved the Project Connect investment that will build light rail, commuter rail, enhanced bus service, and other much-needed improvements across the city. It was a historic vote, but the work is far from done. A big part of the work includes retrofitting our city so that we maximize access to the new systems. If we're going to pay good tax dollars for this infrastructure, we need to make sure that as many people get to use it as possible. Excuse me. That means we have to make some policy tweaks to prioritize more places for more people around the new stations and stops. We've been building a car-dependent city for decades. Now it's time for some of what the wonks call transit-oriented development. It's just a fancy way of saying that we're going to put housing, jobs, and other amenities near stations in a way that makes walking to and from transit easier and more attractive to people. We know transit investment attracts new development everywhere. It's not unique to Austin. We've seen it in our commuter rail line at Crestview, MLK Station, and Plaza Saltillo. We also see home prices in our urban core, the most walkable, transit-friendly part of town, continue to skyrocket. All this is the market's way of telling us that people really enjoy living and working near high-quality transit and are willing to pay a premium for it. That means development associated with Project Connect runs a high risk of displacing exactly those residents who currently depend on the bus to get around. We cannot let that happen, which is why at our city council meeting next Thursday, I'm bringing forward a resolution that would start the process of creating an equitable transit-oriented development policy. Last year, also known as an ETOD. It's an idea other cities have pursued, including Chicago. Last year, that city adopted a new plan that defines ETOD as development that enables all people, regardless of income, race, ethnicity, age, gender, immigration status, or ability, to experience the benefits of dense, mixed-use, pedestrian-oriented development near transit hubs. Someone who worked closely on the development of that plan is Kendra Freeman. Hi, Kendra. Thanks for joining us. Kendra oversees housing policy and ETOD programs for the Chicago-based nonprofit Metropolitan Planning Council. She holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and a master's in public administration from DePaul University, has a background in affordable housing development and management. She co-chairs the group Elevated Chicago and is on the advisory committee for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation, Greater Chicago. And with all that, she found time somehow to join us tonight, live from the Windy City, to talk about equitable transit-oriented development. I'd like to welcome Kendra Freeman to Austin and to our show. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, so this conversation has been pretty popular for us. I can imagine it's been all-consuming for you as well.
It has. I mean, I think I was listening to you talk about transit-oriented development, and those are a lot of the things that we typically hear when we talk about TOD. You know, you hear about high density, you hear about a mix of uses, so whether it's commercial or housing or amenities. We hear about connectivity and the benefits of having lower car dependence, the access to better jobs, lower emissions, better air quality. But when we think about equitable TOD, like, what does that really mean? The way we've been thinking about it in the work that we've been doing for the last several years is about connecting communities and people through transit and doing development that really puts people first. I think when you think about equitable development around transit too, it's an opportunity to think about how do you begin to reduce socioeconomic gaps and to support social and economic resilience that benefits a wide range of people. And, you know, that's not necessarily been the legacy of TOD when it first started.
Well, so let me ask you this. What do you think makes Chicago and the efforts that y'all are putting forward unique and special in these conversations that folks are having all around the country about ETODs?
Yeah, I think it's a couple of things we tried to do. So Chicago, we have a legacy transit system. So we're very fortunate. We've had our fixed rail system for a really long time. We have a pretty broad bus system that covers a good portion of the city and suburbs and commuter rail. So we're pretty well connected. I mean, we do still have some transit deserts, so we're pretty well connected overall with transit. In 2013 is when the city originally adopted the first TOD ordinance, and it had been strengthened over time. And we're a policy change organization at MPC. So we try to use research and collaborative advocacy to really help improve policy at the city and the regional level. So we've been following this since early 2013 and working with the city to strengthen their TOD policy over time. I think what was somewhat unique was as the previous administration was fading out, they wanted to do something that was a legacy project. So they said, hey, let's look at the TOD ordinance and let's see if we can expand it to not just include land around fixed rail stations, but also to include about 24 or so high frequency, high ridership bus routes. And they came to us and said, well, what do you think about that? And we said, well, that's not bad. But we know, from our history that just creating an incentive or a geography does not necessarily bring investment and development to, especially in neighborhoods that have seen disinvestment for decades and decades. And that's our reality in Chicago. I think most people know of us as being a city that's very segregated. And the west and south sides, which are typically BIPOC communities, we have incredible transit assets, but we also have vacant land around those assets. And there's lots of barriers to why development hasn't happened in those lands. So we took that opportunity to work with the mayor's office to say, hey, how can we really create some equity and some support around looking at how we're experiencing displacement around transit. And it really happens in two ways in Chicago. In communities that are disinvested, you start to see displacement of residents because of the lack of investment, the lack of amenities, the lack of things that people need, the lack of access. And in areas that are in strong markets or in communities that are changing, we start to see the displacement that you were referring to earlier. When you see more investment coming, when those luxury TOD buildings are popping up, it's raising up rent and home values and pushing out, people who have been there for a really long time, who may be moderate or low income, so they can no longer experience the benefits of living close to transit.
Well, so along those lines, I wonder if you could share, were there any challenges that y'all faced along the way trying to bring this forward that you're willing to share with us that maybe surprised you?
Yeah, I think it was a couple of things that were unique. So what we were able to do is to get language in the ordinance. When the city opened up the ordinance to add the bus routes, we were able to get language in there that gave us, bought us some time to actually build out the ETOD's policy plan. So the language required the city to take a look back and do an evaluation of past transit-oriented development projects, that got the city incentives. And do some analysis and really understand how it impacted different areas in the city. And we saw obviously discrepancies that ran along racial lines with that. And the second part was 18 months to actually build out a plan. So what we tried to do differently is bring a broader group of stakeholders to the table and created the ETOD working group that included over 80 organizations, which included institutions like my organization, but also resident groups, developers, city officials, just a real diversity of people who were being impacted by this new ordinance that, around existing fixed rail stations, but also around the new bus routes. And we tried to create a really collaborative process. That's hard. Some of the challenges were, working to get the initial language in the ordinance, and then we had an administration change. So that delayed everything. So we had to wait for the new people and get them on board and help them understand why this ETOD policy plan was important and then get it passed. And then the pandemic, we were just about to launch, this working group with all these stakeholders and bring people together in March. And then the pandemic hit. And we had to revisit and reshuffle and switch to Zoom and still figure out a way to bring a broad group of stakeholders together to really inform this plan. But we were able to navigate. And then obvious things around trust. And is the city really going to listen to us? And are they going to do something different? Really managing all of those concerns, particularly when you've worked with communities who have gotten the short end of the stick for a really long time.
Right.
We were able to really work through that and build some agency and some trust amongst that group and create a plan that's not just has a depth of great policy recommendations and ways that the city can move forward. One, in considering how do we preserve affordability in areas that are really vulnerable to displacement, and how do we drive investment to areas that haven't seen it. Those are really important parts of the plan that we're proud of. But also, when you look at the plan, it's probably unlike most plans I've seen in the city of Chicago. It has visuals. It has graphs and charts. It has like infographics. It's easy and accessible for like the average person to read. And we were also utilize the network that we built in creating the plan to really push it out during a public comment period. And we were able to get broad comment, for probably communities and people we would have never typically heard from if it was a typical white paper plan, policy wonky kind of thing that normally is put out by government.
Well, I really appreciate that. And as a person for whom, transit conversations, mobility conversations are relatively new to me, within this last 5 years. And I've kind of stumbled into it by way of the advocacy work we were doing and recognizing the inherent connection between housing and transit. I don't know that it had occurred to me before. And I think for most folks, I think we think about the things that we need. We don't necessarily think about the bigger picture and infrastructure and how all the things that are connected also are the same things that, exacerbate that cyclical poverty that, sort of breeds this need for more affordable housing and more access to transit. So I say that to say I went on a transit learning trip with some of my colleagues a couple of years ago now. And it was so very helpful to hear from some folks who had done it before, to hear from them how they were able to execute their P3s. For folks listening, that's a public-private partnership. How they were able to effectively execute their P3s, how they were able to effectively, include the necessary contributions from stakeholders. And that's the question that I would ask you. And it's just something I want to make certain that we don't get wrong. Like you said, when you're dealing with communities that have developed that sort of mistrust callus you really just have to be careful. Every step of the way has to be intentional. So I'd like to be able to glean from you, what strategies are out there that can expand community engagement in a way that really includes more renters. Austin is over 50% renters. More than half of our residents are renters. More Black residents, more Latinx residents, more residents with disabilities, and so forth.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of the work I do is rooted in like, how do we make this real for community members to be able to have a seat at the table? And I think one thing is we gotta demystify some of the conversations we have around development and transit. I mean, the concepts are not as complicated as the way we talk about them too. I like to use often the analogy of like going to the grocery store when I talk about development and trade-offs. Like I may go in the grocery store and if I'm hungry, I'm putting 11 things in my cart. But before I get to the checkout counter, I know what my budget is. So then I have to make some hard decisions about what's going to the checkout line. And it's similar when you talk about development. If you help people like understand the concepts in a way, that relates to their lives and it's their community. So they understand like what is needed as far as facilities, as far as amenities. And if you help them understand the cost and like, how do we get from here to here, which sometimes means compromise, most people, if you walk them through that process, will understand and they'll be able to help, they'll be able to make trade-offs and they'll be able to support that, when you get to the point of like having to defend it before city council or public comment because you did that process together. But if you don't have that transparency, if you don't set the stage, for co-creation, then that's when you tend to, get the dishonesty, you get the distrust. I mean, government servants are often coming in from a place of, distrust anyway, because of the harm that the government has done to communities of color for decades in this country. Right. And that's understandable, but you have to acknowledge that. You have to make room for that. And then you have to use transparency, use participatory practices, allow people to create with you to build that trust and to get to that. To get to that next level.
I really appreciate that. That's helpful. And it also just is a really good reminder, because this isn't the only conversation where we want to make certain that the appropriate people are at the table. And so I guess along those lines about the appropriate stakeholders being at the table, I'd like to be able to glean from you. Chicago is using ETOD to incentivize investment in underinvested communities. But do you think that there's any utility in using it to create affordable housing in high opportunity areas?
Yes, that is certainly part of our plan too. I think, again, we look at the two ends. So we look at disinvested communities and communities that are rapidly changing where affordability is being lost. And so we've done a couple of things. The city of Chicago has also revised our inclusionary housing policy recently. And we work with the Department of Housing to think about like, how do you prioritize spaces near transit?
You said you guys revised your, did you say your inclusionary housing policy?
And that's essentially whenever like city land is used or there's a density bonus or a zoning change, it kicks in a policy that requires affordability on site for that development, by the developer. And there are ways to get around it. I mean, there's like in lieu fees where you can, instead of building the units as part of your development, you can put in your money into a pot that creates affordable housing. But the city just went through a process of trying to strengthen that to make sure, and that the strengthening of that policy is really focused on how do we get more affordable units in high income changing communities that are vulnerable, that where more people are vulnerable for displacement because they don't have enough affordable housing. But I think, just overall, it's important to understand every community is different. And they're going to need to be different strategies.
Absolutely.
So, and the other thing that we've seen is not just the loss of affordable rental housing that we're seeing in rapidly changing communities, it's also the loss of local businesses. So how can it also be an opportunity not just to preserve affordable housing, but to also preserve affordable commercial or mixed use spaces that allow for incubation and sustainability of small mom and pop businesses in locally owned businesses, particularly by people of color.
I really appreciate that you pointed that out. I think the commercial component gets left out a lot, myself included. The housing just seems so pressing that I think sometimes we forget about the commercial component. But the truth of the matter is, for people in Austin, where, by the way, we can't do inclusionary zoning, our state doesn't allow it. But for people in Austin and in the historic Black community, so frequently access came by way of owning a business, and oftentimes that meant brick and mortar. And so I really appreciate that you brought that point up. I'm going to ask you one last question before we let you go. But there's a lot of bus conversations that we're having around here. So transit-oriented development seems to usually go hand in hand with rail infrastructure. But I'd like to know from you, is there any benefit to allowing transit-oriented development near bus lines?
I think so. And this is what the latest amendment to the ordinance did. It allowed for the benefits to be used on 24 or so high ridership bus lines. We have not seen that first development happen yet because it's still a little bit early, but we're really excited to see what that looks like. The city is kind of taking another look at, when you look at a bus route, that's a pretty expansive area that entails. So how do they kind of fine tune some of the incentive areas, and particularly aligning them where buses intersect with transit stations or where buses intersect with commercial corridors that have been dilapidated or really need updates, is a good opportunity to think about, how those density bonus, how those parking reductions can help enable development along bus lines, especially in places where bus lines, are the only thing that's really connecting you to either the central business district or need goods and services, or in some cases the train, so you can get to the next leg of your journey. Still very early for us, but we're excited to see what development and what TOD incentives along those bus routes can look like.
And it being early for y'all and us being at the very, very beginning of our planning stages means I get to pester you a lot. And so hopefully you'll be open to me reaching out to talk. I think you touched on some things that I think about often. How do we demystify this conversation and have it without that air of condescension that really puts people out?
Yeah.
And truth be told, there aren't a lot of people of color having, the technical conversations around transit and development. And I really look forward to that evolving as well. But with that, I think we're going to go ahead and let you go, unless there's anything else you'd like to tell our viewers before you get back to work.
No, just thank you so much for the time. If you want to check out the ETO plan, we could share a link for that. Our work that we've done locally around ETOD is on our website, metroplanning.org. And again, just thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Have a good evening and a great weekend.
You too.
Thank you. That was awesome. Kendra Freeman from the Chicago-based nonprofit Metropolitan Planning Council. I really want to thank her again for joining us tonight. But we're not done yet. May is National Bike Month and June is Black Music Month. So let's combine the two to talk with the founder of the Black History Bike Ride. Talib Abdullahi launched the social ride last summer amidst the great outcry for justice following the killing of George Floyd. The unique blend of learning about local history while also enjoying the fun of cycling proved hugely popular and drew over 400 participants to the inaugural ride. Next month, Talib has two big events for the Black History Bike Ride. He joins us now to talk about them. Thank you for joining us, Talib.
Hey, Natasha. Thanks for having me.
Sure thing. It's good to see you outside of disaster relief efforts.
Hey, there was a lot of great work happening out there, but I saw you out there every day. You were moving around, helping as many people as possible.
I appreciate you recognizing that, but I saw you too, so right back at you, boomerang.
Hey, there we go.
So I won't ask you too many questions. I really want you to be able to tell folks kind of what your inspiration was. I know there's a lot of conversation around biking in the Black community, and maybe that's something we'll talk about when we have you on again. But, you've been written up in outlets across the country or across the city. But just for folks who don't know, can you tell us the story of how the Black History Bike Ride actually came to be?
Sure. So, I moved here when I was 18 to go to UT, and at the time, cycling was my only way to get around. And I ended up graduating from UT with an American Studies degree. So, you know, that's kind of my, personal history and my cycling history in a nutshell. Kind of in the wake of the killing of George Floyd last June, I went to many of the protests and was just having a lot of conversations with friends and other people out in the streets. And from my coursework at UT, really became aware of a lot of the issues and a lot of Austin's racialized history, especially in the context of Black history. And after having many conversations and attending some of the protests, it was right after the Houston-Tillotson March. That was such a beautiful day. I just put out on my own personal social media channel, like, hey, why don't we go out and we do a bike ride, and we just ride in between some of the historic freedmen's towns and different locations around town, because Austin has a really rich, a really beautiful, and really interesting legacy of Black history. And due to many current factors, many people are unaware of them. So I feel that riding a bike in between a lot of these locations provides both just a very informative way to take in and learn about some histories that we may not know, as well as being really healthy. And it's just it's a good way to get out there.
I appreciate that. And it really is a good way to get out and get some fresh air. And I appreciate that you're recognizing just how rich the history, Austin's Black history is. And I sort of wonder, what has teaching Austin's Black history to other people taught you?
Well, there's always more to learn, but it's always important to know that every little bit counts. You have to start somewhere. So I've encountered people that I had a great conversation today with Javier Wallace, who's one of the just a fountain of knowledge, and many other historians in town. And I've also encountered people who have, some of whom are actually transplants from other parts of the country that have little understanding of it. So, it's important to remember that no matter how young or old, there's always a good place to start in terms of learning history. And also, I would preface it by saying that this is our history as Austinites and as Americans. I just enjoy history in general. So when we talk about it, it really is about this being our community's history. That is something that we should all just think about as a way to shape and inform the future.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. So one of the challenges of doing a Black History bike ride in Austin is our limited bike infrastructure. It really does restrict you to kind of a smaller area. How do you incorporate really important areas like St. John's or Montopolis into that curriculum?
Well, at the current moment, riding bikes up to St. John's is definitely trickier. There are some areas where I feel like the cycling infrastructure is wonderful, but there are many areas where I think there's probably a lot of work to be done. With regards to Montopolis, it took a very, very, very long time, but there's now the bikeway, I think a hike bikeway, that is now the old historic Montopolis Bridge. So there are some inroads being made, but even when you get kind of up to the Montopolis area, the cycling infrastructure there, could be improved. So in a lot of ways, we rely on oral histories really just to talk about the locations, but to go directly is something we're looking forward to having in the future.
That's fair. So your website has a passage that says, "For centuries, Black Americans have fought for equality. Let's keep the fight alive. Grab your bike." Talk to us about using a bike as a tool for equality and equity.
I would love to talk about that. I think in some people's minds and in many facets, for a long time, I think people have thought of bikes somewhat as toys or things that children play with, which is 100% accurate at certain points in life. But I think the real context is that bikes are machines for freedom. And bikes allow us to see our world slightly differently, and really do provide a certain sense of freedom that neither walking nor driving provides, kind of like a sensory access towards the world. And it also actually, helps make just access to different locations and access to work and different opportunities much more available to people who aren't able to afford cars, or have limited, live in different parts of the city. Cycling really does help them open that up. So I think that kind of the long form vision of this project is to really help redefine what we use bikes for, and how we see them as utilitarian objects, from something that in some ways some people just see as toys for children, to things that can really heavily influence and shape our world for the better, both in increasing access, but also decreasing emissions and increasing your own personal health.
Absolutely. So you have a couple of pretty big events coming up in June. You want to talk to us about them?
Yes, absolutely. So we have, as part of Six Squares Beyond the Square event, on Sunday, we will be doing the first ride of we're doing a Black musical history tour of East Austin. So we're going to highlight several different places and people that were really significant to Austin's Black musical legacy. I think it's something that's very important to underscore, since we are the live music capital of the world. And many of the heroes that we credit, such as Stevie Ray Vaughan, I have on good word from a friend of Stevie Ray Vaughan's that he would regularly credit several different African-American blues guitarists who lived in Austin. Those were his friends, and that's who he was trying to emulate. So I believe it's really important that we continue the conversation about Black musical legacies. I'm actually wearing my Juneteenth Blues Festival t-shirt from 1987. It's actually my mom's, in honor of my love for blues music and for music in general. So long story, we're doing a ride on June 6th. All the info is on the Six Square site. I believe more info about that can be found on Six Square's social media channels, and the Long Centers. The Long Centers where you buy tickets for Beyond the Square. So that's June 6th at 10 a.m. And then we also are going to be having a Juneteenth social ride. This will be similar to our large social ride that happened last year. That one will also start at 10 a.m. on June 19th, which is a Saturday. It'll be an inclusive at a comfortable pace, and we'll stop at 6 different locations and highlight some significant history there. We also have 4 special guest speakers lined up, and I'm really excited to share with y'all who those folks are going to be via social media quickly. So keep up with us, Black History Bike Ride on Instagram, as well as our website, blackhistorybike.com.
Was that a tease? I thought you were actually going to tell us who they are. You were telling us you'll tell us later.
I mean, we're still working that out.
Okay.
Harrison, one of them will be Harrison Eppright.
Okay. Oh, awesome. He's amazing.
Yeah, Harrison Eppright will be kind of our kind of main speaker. And then we'll also have Darwin Hamilton speaking at the Dedrick Hamilton House.
Awesome.
And, yes. Yeah. So those are just 2. We got a couple others.
Well, I mean, you got great folks. Those are both folks that I respect a great deal. And I think Darwin being able to speak about his family's actual property is pretty amazing. And Mr. Eppright, I mean, aside from being a wealth of information, he's just such a dynamic spirit. So I think so far so good. You have really good speakers. So
thank you.
Is there anything else you'd like to add? Anything else we need to know?
Well, you can find out more information about our project at blackhistorybike.com, and our Instagram handle is Black History Bike Ride. That's where we keep things more active. And we have several really exciting things to announce in the next couple of weeks about both events. So stay tuned.
Awesome. Well, we won't keep you much longer. We really appreciate you coming to visit. I don't know that I'll be able to make the event on the 6th, but I am going to try to make the one on the 19th.
All right. Bring out your bike.
Say again?
Bring your bike out.
I will. You know, and I'm sort of, you probably already are working with them groups like Black Girls Do Bike and those kinds of things around town. So I'll be seeing really familiar faces that I love out there as well. So thank you for joining us this evening. I hope you have a great evening and a good weekend. And we'll probably be talking to you again real soon.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you for having me. And yeah, let's go for a bike ride.
I look forward to it.
All right.
Awesome. I love riding my bike. So Talib Abdullahi, founder of the Black History Bike Ride. I really want to thank him again for joining us. Both of those events sound like a lot of fun. Sound like a good way to get out after having been pent up for so long. So I think you guys should check it out for sure. But that does it for this week's installment of Talk with Tasha. We'll be back here again on Friday, June 11th. In the meantime, if you have any questions or concerns, you can always reach out to us at the District 1 office. That's District 1, the number 1 at austintexas.gov. So until next time, stay safe, stay healthy. Take care, y'all.